is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea, then the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Caleb Holloman. Today we will be going over Hitler's pet alligator, passenger balloons that will travel into space, and a priest in Russia who refuses to accept COVID as truth, and to prove so has used a militia to take over a monastery. Stick around to the end and I'll give you my top 10 weird news Samuel Clemens facts and quotes. For those who don't know, Samuel Clemens is actually Mark Twain, but we will get into that later. Alright folks, you know I don't like to start the weekend on sad news, but I feel I have to cover this. A little while back, a world-famous alligator died. Now, why was this alligator famous? He's rumored to be Hitler's personal alligator. Now, of course, I'm talking about Adolf Hitler. It's important that I clarify that. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party. He was pretty popular back in the day. Doesn't garner such a great record now. It's important that I clarify that it was his and not Paula Hitler's. Well, we should keep her out of this. He was an American alligator, and he died May 22nd, 2020 in Moscow. Now, most alligators live between 35 and 50 years of age, but this alligator lived to be 84. And between those 84 years, this alligator lived a fairly interesting life, even apart from the fact that he belonged to Adolf Hitler. He was born in Mississippi, I should say hatched in Mississippi. Soon after that, he was transferred to the Berlin Zoo, where he was named Saturn. Perhaps he was named after the planet, but I think it's more likely he was named after the god of disillusion, the ancient Greek god. Anyways, during his stay at the Berlin Zoo, he would have Hitler come and visit him often. It was said that among all the animals, Hitler took a liking mostly to this pet alligator Saturn. For some reason, it doesn't surprise me that Hitler was so interested in a scaly, slimy, and vicious predator. It's said that he would come by and personally feed his alligator with rats and other animals he would find around Berlin during World War II. Now, I don't want to paint this Adolf Hitler character as an affectionate person, but there's a lot of heartwarming anecdotes about him feeding innocent animals to this vicious predator, during World War II, where he was trying to take over Europe and commit mass genocide across his nation. But as his war efforts began to fail, he visited his pet alligator Saturn less and less. Eventually, the Allied forces came upon Berlin, and frankly, they were kind of peeved about this whole World War II issue. Look, let's not even kid ourselves. They were downright pissed. So while blinded with rage, they drop a few bombs on Berlin, as if just to say we don't really appreciate what's been going on here the past couple years. And they end up destroying the Berlin Zoological Garden, Saturn's home. Apparently, One of their bombs landed right on the aquarium where he was stored, which should have meant a sad end for the beautiful creature, the beautiful alligator. But it turns out of the 16,000 animals that were at the zoo, 96 of them survived, one of them being Saturn, Adolf Hitler's alligator. The building was destroyed on the 23rd of November, 1943. It's estimated that over 30 other alligators were killed in the bombing. Local reports document that the streets of Berlin, I shouldn't be laughing, they document that the streets of Berlin were littered with crocodile corpses, but that some, including Saturn, survived and ended up going through the city in search for food, which I'm sure they didn't have a problem finding. Nothing raises your appetite quite like a bomb landing on your house. So Saturn survives this horrible bombing in Berlin, and he just kind of pimps around for 3 years, eating as he goes along. And then a German lady recognizes him as Hitler's alligator. The lady, she isn't named, so we'll call her Frau Becky. So Frau Becky comes across this alligator and says, "Hey, I'll be damned, that looks an awful lot like Hitler's alligator." So this was in 1946, a year after the war ended, and they say that this is when the alligator Saturn reached his full size, the biggest size he would ever be, 11.5 feet long. Goodness gracious. That's taller than LeBron James, people. That's like 11.5 Subway sandwiches. So anyway, Frau Becky says, "Hey, British people over there, look, it's Hitler's alligator." And so the British soldiers go, "Hey, that's pretty neat. Why don't we ship him to Russia?" So they ship him to Leipzig. Once again, I believe I mispronounced that correctly. The records kept regarding the transfer of Saturn from the British to the Russians was unfortunately destroyed in a fire in 1950. Some classified information destroyed by the Soviet Union, as is tradition. But we do know that by the end of 1946, he had been transferred to Moscow in order to live in a zoo, where he quickly garnered the reputation of being Hitler's personal alligator. He was said to be one of the most popular attractions, and eventually he gained the nickname Hitler. Not very creative. I like Saturn better. To be perfectly frank, if I owned an alligator, I would name him Saturn. Multiple names before Hitler would come up. But that's just me. Maybe I'm a little over politically correct. And they go on to say that in 1993, during the constitutional crisis, Russian tanks were going down the streets of Moscow. This supposedly reminded Saturn of the bombing of Berlin, and he started to cry out in painful memory. That's what one of the zookeepers said. But other than that, it said that he enjoyed his time largely while in the Soviet Union. He was apparently fed rabbits, rats, and fish, among other things. Now, many citizens of the Soviet Union will complain that, well, a alligator named Hitler was receiving a varied meal every single day. 40 million of them were starving, it says here in this article. So, kind of a bit prejudice against the people of the Soviet Union. They favor an alligator named Hitler over their own people. Now, look, I don't want to get political or anything, but I think that's wrong. That while 40 million people starve, Alligator, nicknamed Hitler, gets fed 3 varied courses a day. But hey, that's just me. So on a lighter note, in the 1950s, the United States gifted a young female alligator to the Soviet Union as a gift. Now, before we go into the further implications of this gift, I have to ask, why does everybody think alligators are an appropriate gift to the Soviet Union post-wartime? First, the British give them a gift of a male alligator, Hitler's personal alligator, and the Soviets they were not fans of Hitler. I think 20 million Soviet citizens died during World War II facing Hitler. So I can't imagine that they would be entirely fond of this reptilian memento of Führer Hitler. But then the Americans get on board with the Brits and they say, hey, you guys want a female alligator? We'll gift you a female alligator. I don't mean to upbraid, but I don't think that's an appropriate post-wartime gift. So anyways, this younger female alligator, her name was Shipka. Shipka, for those who don't know, means rose hip. or if you're in the Netherlands, it means hat. So that's a fun fact for you. So Shipka, get this, she mates with Saturn. I bet you didn't see that coming. Unfortunately, though, they did not produce any offspring, as all of Shipka's eggs were unfertile. They eventually grew old together, and Shipka, being 13 years younger than Saturn, eventually died. And Saturn was apparently incredibly depressed by this event and refused to eat food for a long time. That's so sad. It's like a scaly reptilian version of Where the Red Fern Grows. You guys remember that awful book they make you read in school so you learn about death? Yeah, except instead of fluffy cute dogs, it's vicious predators named after Adolf Hitler. But the story moves on. By 2005, it was said that Saturn had a new mate who was then 30 years old. Let's see, 2005, so Saturn would have been nearly 80. He would have been 79. And he's dating a gator half his age. That's, I know this isn't the relationship podcast, but that doesn't sound like it's going to work out too well. Now, it's noted in this article that World War II was not the only hellscape that Saturn heroically avoided dying. But apparently, while in his stay at the Moscow Zoo in the 1980s, the entire aquarium ceiling that was housing him collapsed. But they had taken him out for his weekly inspection before that actually happened. So he got lucky there as well. I'm kind of upset that they don't tell whether or not his second wife, his, 50-year younger wife, survived or not during this tragic cave-in at the aquarium. And this one's sad. And then later, a drunk visitor at the zoo threw a boulder on his head to wake him up while he was sleeping. It's like Piggy in Lord of the Flies. There's a lot of tragic parallels between Hitler's alligator and a lot of tragic protagonists in childhood books. But after this boulder landed on Saturn's head, the zoo veterinarians fought to keep him alive for apparently several months. It was a struggle, they said. They said they didn't think he was going to make it. But he toughened out and he survived. He survived just long enough for a group of tourists to throw a bunch of glass bottles at him in the 2000s. This is so upsetting. But after all these incidents, they made the pen safer by putting a giant plexiglass wall between the people and the alligator. Saturn was apparently not too happy about this either. He stopped eating for nearly an entire year after they put up the glass panel. So I guess some animals thrive when their protective instincts are challenged. And I think what we've learned over the past 15 minutes is that Hitler's alligator is one tough son of a gun. He resumed eating in the 2010s, and during his entire stay at the Moscow Zoo, he only had one outburst, where he nearly bit off the hand of an inexperienced warden who tried to feed him out of the palm of his hand. I find it funny that the title of Adolf Hitler's Alligator wasn't enough to scare this guy. He thought he could feed it by hand. And he survived, and so did the alligator, all the way up to the age of 84, before he tragically died on May 22nd, 2020. A sad ending as the circle of life continues. Stay tuned. After the break, we're going to talk about balloon rides into space. That's going to be a good one. Stay tuned.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts. Past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
And welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We just talked a little bit about Hitler's pet alligator. Coming up, we have the top 10 Samuel Clemens moments. That's going to be a hoot and a holler, no doubt. But for now, it's time to get high, as a firm offers balloon rides from Alaska to the edge of space. Sounds like a great idea. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is a Florida-based startup firm called Space Perspective, and they are planning to use the Pacific Spaceport Complex in Kodiak to serve as one of the launch sites for the vehicle called Spaceship Neptune. The Anchorage Daily News reported this Sunday. This is hot off the press. Space Perspective plans on providing balloon rides manned with 8 passengers and a pressurized capsule suspended beneath a hydrogen balloon. Yeah, historically that's gone well. For those who don't know, there is this big old ship, well, they called it a Zeppelin, and it was named the Hindenburg, and it was too filled with hydrogen gas as its means of flight. And for those who don't know, 35 people died while riding on it because it exploded in midair. If you've ever seen the Led Zeppelin's first album cover, you know you probably won't want to ride in anything powered or filled with one of the most explosive gases on the planet. I mean, these are the same gases that keep our sun burning. And Space Perspective plans on flying customers in a pressurized capsule under all this hydrogen gas, stored it in a balloon the size of a football stadium. What what could possibly go wrong? They're going all the way up to space. So this company, Space Perspective, estimates that each ticket will cost $125,000 for a 6-hour journey. So that's like a 20 grand an hour, or 347 per minute. That's a lot of money. Mark Lester, CEO of the company, said that the high-altitude rides will be available from Kodiak, Alaska in just a few years. And he's very excited by, quote, the growth of tourism sure to come as a result of the ambitious flight exploration programs. You will have people from around the world who want to come to Alaska and see the northern lights from the edge of space. And it said that Space Perspective has already started testing and refining spaceport operations and secure space flight licenses from the Federal Aviation Administration. So this is official. They're going for it. I don't know about you guys, but I'm putting all my extra money in these people's stock. I mean, they're just a furnace of ambition. Space Perspective plans to complete the test flights at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida by the end of next year. The ascent itself is said to take 2 hours as the vessel travels 19 miles above Earth. That's 31 kilometers. Lester, CEO of the company, says it'll be a prime opportunity for social media posts. He says they'll be actually able to post on social media and send data while in the air, 19 miles above the Earth. That's just insane. Like I said, furnace of ambition, these people. Lester goes on to say, quote, Neptune then makes a 2-hour descent under the balloon and splashes down, where a ship retrieves the passengers along with the capsule and balloon. The capsule recovery will occur in the waters around Kodiak Island, Alaska. How could that possibly go wrong? Land in freezing waters of Alaska. It's said that the balloon design is taken from technology that NASA has used in the past for decades to fly Large Research Telescope. Now that sounds reassuring, right? NASA's behind this, and they have a pretty decent record, with the exception of a few explosions taking out some of our best and brightest people. But we don't have to get that dark. So I dug a little deeper into this. I went to nasa.gov/scientific balloons. And it turns out that they have a big section on flight termination. So the way their balloons work is that once the leaders of the operation feel that all the objectives of the mission have been met, the decision to end or terminate the balloon is made. Oh my gosh. So, once they feel that the landing area is clear and ready for the payload to return to Earth, a command is sent to the balloon, which separates the payload from the balloon, and the payload falls to Earth with a parachute attached to it. So imagine, instead of being an actual payload, these are 8 human beings in a capsule. And these 8 human beings fall 19 miles to Earth, but they have a parachute, so it's okay. And then the CEO, Mark Lester, he goes on to reassure you that the capsule is pressurized. So that's his number one concern, is that the capsule has to be pressurized. That way you don't get dizzy as you lose oxygen going 19 miles in the air, supported by an explosive fueled balloon that's designed to separate from your housing capsule once it hits 19 miles in the air and let you fall by parachute into the Alaskan Sea. So there's about 35 ways that could go wrong, and one where it could go right. So maybe it'll happen eventually. I don't know. I'm not an expert on technologies, but 1 to 35 odds, that's pretty good. So if I were you, I would also invest your money in this company, the Alaskan Aerospace Corporation. As said before, this is pretty ambitious stuff. Now, of course, there's good news in all of this. Finally, flat earthers, for the low cost of $125,000, can finally prove to us all that they are correct. I don't foresee this going well with them at all. No, in all seriousness, it would actually be pretty cool if they could get this to reliably work. And honestly, $125,000 to go to the edge of the atmosphere does not sound too expensive when it costs, I think it was like $10,000 per pound of payload put on a NASA space shuttle to get to space. So really, $125,000 is not that much when talking about the greatest hot air balloon trip ever. It still frightens me, though, because I'm already frightened of hot air balloons. Right? I've never been one to say, hey, I want to ride in a giant balloon with a blazing fire underneath it. That doesn't sound like my idea of a good time. How did Caleb die? He exploded when he was 19 miles in the sky. Actually, that would look pretty cool on a tombstone. Maybe that can be a new way to handle deceased people. They can sign up to be sent into space 19 miles up and be exploded in the air and fill the atmosphere with their dusty remains. I don't know why I'm getting so grim on today's episode. I apologize for that. And I don't mean to find fault with today's greatest innovators. I'm just a naturally skeptical person. Some call me cynical. But I think I'm right on this one. I think I'm using logic and rationality to say that there might be a few complications. That's how we'll put it. There might be a few complications with the prospect of flying 19 miles into space under a giant bomb, essentially. I don't know. Why don't you guys let me know in the comments? DM me. If you're on Twitter, follow us at Weird News Podcast on Twitter, GSMC_Weird News, and let me know what you think. Do you think flying to the edge of space in a hydrogen balloon is a good idea? I mean, it didn't work out so well for the Hindenburg, which was not even a mile off the ground. And that thing was made of steel. It wasn't a balloon. Well, it wasn't made of steel. It was lead. It was a lead Zeppelin. But it wasn't a balloon. It's not something you can bend into the shape of a puppy. So the Hindenburg was made of lead, and I'm looking it up now. The most agreed upon cause of the explosion was a static spark. So you know how you shuffle your feet over carpet and then you shock your sister and then she punches you in the nose? That little shock is what caused a giant balloon of lead to explode while it was full of hydrogen. And these people want to get it through the clouds, which, has enough static electricity to create lightning. And they don't expect any of this to go wrong, which I think is a bit presumptuous. And I know I'm lingering on this, but I mean, we can't even get our crap together for COVID or brutality or riots. And during all that, we're going to attempt to fill a football field-size balloon with the most explosive gas on the planet, send it 19 miles into the sky, and then detach it from the balloon and parachute down into an Alaskan ocean. Which, often sits at around 38 degrees, it looks like. So that's 6 degrees Fahrenheit above freezing. So if literally any one thing goes wrong during one of these launches, everybody's dead. There's no surviving this whatsoever. But as previously stated, it would be a pretty neat epitaph. Here lies Caleb Holloman, who exploded in space and landed in an ocean where he froze to death. That's one hell of a way to go out. And they want to get this done by next year. And personally, I think these vessels, these football field-sized balloons, I think these are the optimal standard, or what should be the standard for the Space Force Armory. I think these are the perfect way to protect space. And I think our brave fighting men and women would love it too. Be able to fly in space on a giant balloon. I don't know. Probably wouldn't go well with guns and all that. It can't take a static spark when it's made out of lead. And the Hindenburg was only 650 feet in the air when it exploded. They want this thing to be 19 miles in the sky. That's just so inconceivable. To give you an idea, Mount Everest is less than 6 miles in the sky. So that's more than 3 Mount Everests. But it would actually be pretty cool. It would be a neat... you wouldn't forget it, that's for sure. So if you've been saving $125,000 to buy a house, maybe reconsider that investment and buy a ticket to space. Alright, it's time to take another break. But stay tuned for after the break, when we will talk about a COVID-19 denying priest in Russia who took over a monastery with the help of an armed militia. This is going to be fun. Alright, stay tuned after the break.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We just had a nice little chat about some space balloons for passengers. Now it's time to go over the COVID-19 denying priest who seized control of a Russian monastery with the help of his armed militia. The priest's name is Father Sergei Romanov, and he's being called a far-right Russian priest. Not priests, just priest. He has taken control of Sednarouse convent outside of the city of Yekaterinburg, and has multiple times challenged authorities to, quote, force him out. He's very proud of his armed militia. Romanov is a former policeman who reportedly spent 13 years in prison for murder before, quote, repenting and dedicating his life to religion. He does harass the church leaders of Russia, however, for, quote, working with the forerunners of the Antichrist by closing churches due to COVID-19 pandemic. So, as a result of this spicy rhetoric, the Russian Orthodox Church suspended Sergei by preventing him from preaching. They went so far as to forbade him to wear a cross. So they don't want to associate with this man at all, it should be noted. And this, quote, encouraged people to disobey public health orders as it made them furious that their priest was forbade from wearing a cross. So after this man's jail time in the early 2000s, he helped found the Srednirolask convent. And I guess he felt entitled to this establishment because a few weeks ago he busted in there and seized control of the convent with several armed militiamen. So this guy's not screwing around. He really does think this is the work of the Antichrist in Russia. He went on to say, quote, I'm not going anywhere. They'll have to chase me out with police and National Guard. Continuing their opposition to him, the Russian diocese said, quote, you need to rectify the situation and repent by June 26th. I like how they put a date on it. But Sergei, much like the ambitious people with their space air balloons, says he is not going anywhere. And in fact, he has gained hundreds of supporters, including dozens of armed Cossacks, believed to be veterans of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. After the Russian diocese told him to rectify the situation and repent, Romanov told them that they will have to storm the monastery. Yeah, that's nice. Turn the other cheek there, isn't it, Romanov? So the article says he's far right, but then it goes on to say that he's also a devout monarchist. He once changed his secular name to Nikolai Romanov in honor of Russia's last Tsar, Nicholas II. And he is considered one of the leaders of the Tsar worshippers, which is apparently a movement within the Russian Orthodox Church. And he kind of has a reputation for this kind of thing, for conspiracy, claiming that COVID is a satanic way of closing churches. He previously has accused President Putin of inserting surveillance chips. He says that they were inserted into people under guise of being a COVID-19 vaccine. And he billed the ongoing pandemic as a satanic fascist plot. So, he's not a fan of wearing masks, to say the least. He now has over 500 armed supporters behind him, and the Orthodox Church expects him to be preparing for a drawn-out siege. And they say it'll look something like a new Waco. And for those who don't know what Waco is, it was a siege that occurred in Texas, where a religious group was holding down a complex. They had been stockpiling weapons for months in preparations for this, and they were under siege by the government for 51 days. And the siege ended in a fire, which resulted in it's really sad. It resulted in 76 deaths in the religious group, and the sad part is that it included a bunch of children and pregnant women. It was a disaster, and the Russians expect this to turn out similarly. The priest takes personal offense to COVID-19. He says, quote, "The disease forbids me to serve, forbids me to speak, and I was blessed to speak." So he's got a bit of an ego going too, and that's the really hurtful thing, I think, is ego doesn't raise healthy children. So to me, that's the sad part, is probably a lot of children are going to get involved in this. But it is kind of fun to look this guy up. I mean, you can just tell by looking at him that he's completely out of his mind. I mean, he's a Tsar worshiper. He's got this giant beard and a big ponytail. He wears a cloak with a bunch of archaic symbols on it. I mean, he looks like a modern interpretation of a warlock. Some of the photos have him wearing a nice beanie, which I'm sure helps with the cold Russian winters. It's kind of sad, but it's kind of funny to look it up. Hopefully nobody gets hurt. Hopefully innocent children don't get involved. And hopefully it all deflates as we find a cure for this awful disease. But yeah, there is good news coming from Russia, though. I kind of feel bad for bringing up all the weird stuff going on in Russia, from Hitler's Alligator to a czar-worshipping priest that's creating a second Waco. We got some good news. A Russian couple built a huge replica of the Great Pyramid of Giza in his backyard. They're making good time of the quarantine allotted to them. So their names are Andrei and Victoria Vakhusheva. And they decided to build giant pyramids in their backyard. So this couple lives in St. Petersburg, and they already had a flourishing garden, and then they decided to build a 30-foot tall pyramid, which I think is a good allocation of resources and time. It's, got to keep busy somehow. The reporter reporting on this seemed awfully disappointed, which I find funny. He's disappointed that it's made of concrete, because the originals were made with basalt and volcanic rock. So he's upset they weren't made with Russian volcanoes. Oh well. You gotta work with what you know. And apparently they know concrete. One of the builders of the pyramid, Andre, explains, quote, "This is still a monolithic structure. We made careful calculations in terms of masonry, making it in a special way so that it is as close to the original as possible. And it weighs 1,400 tons. That is just insane. That is a lot of concrete." And the couple, they didn't get their blueprints online. They actually traveled all the way to Egypt numerous times in order to study the Giza pyramid itself. So they actually began this project before COVID. And it only took them about a year to build, which is pretty impressive. They have reportedly completed the entire outside structure, and they're working on making the interior readily available and usable. They plan on making it almost like a second house in their backyard. And they're even opening it to casual visitors who would like to tour the pyramid, which is pretty neat because Russia's a long way from Egypt. So people who can't go see the Great Pyramid of Giza can go see a 30-foot tall version. It's not the same, but it's pretty cool that they're letting people see it. Granted, they're charging $50 for it, but I think that's a small price to pay to see a real pretty triangle. I am cynical. What do you know? The inside of the structure will reportedly be sunk 9 meters into the earth, which apparently emulates the real Pyramid of Giza. I didn't know that. I thought it was just a big old triangle, but apparently it has a basement too. That's innovative. Apparently their neighbors don't think it's too innovative. They reportedly thought it was cool at first, but now that they see it's just a giant concrete triangle, that's devaluing their homes because it's just an odd tourist attraction and you don't really want tourists all around your house all the time. They're not happy about it, reportedly. But I think they'll get over it. One of the builders, Victoria, said, quote, "We had to reduce the rest of the pyramid's contours, but the sarcophagus is made of the size as it is in the Cheops pyramid. We just made sure it fits in." Cheops is another name for Khufu, the pharaoh in whose honor the pyramid was built. So there's your useless fact and a half for the week. And I'm kind of impressed they completed it in just a year. I looked it up, and people suspect that the old Egyptian ones took about 2 decades to complete. Granted, they're a little more interesting, being 147 meters tall rather than 10. But also they were completed 5,000 years ago. But besides those 2 facts, it's still fairly impressive that this couple built a pyramid in their backyard. I mean, granted, it wasn't 2.5 million stone blocks that were cut and moved and positioned into a giant pyramid 5,000 years ago, but it's still pretty neat that they made a cast of a triangle and poured some concrete. That's good. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's better if Russia moves more towards that and away from all the Hitler alligators and monarch worshippers. I think they're going in the right direction. We have to focus on the good news, people. News is designed to make you angry. This is what you need to be listening to. Happy news, happy news, happy news. And the popularity of this pyramid, it's kind of blown up on Russian news sites. So, sorry you guys don't get that over here in the US or in the UK, but the family is now planning to build a temple. They said, quote, "We plan to build a temple that will be connected to the pyramid by a passageway." Presumably the family will use these 2 structures as their graves, which I'm sorry I'm talking about death and graves a lot today, but there's so many good ways to go out there, and I think one of them is being buried under your own pyramid. I would be happy about that. I know I'm kind of unorthodox in what makes me happy, but the builders of the pyramid went on to say that they are interested in the ancient Egyptian culture's theories that rulers would become stars after their death. So they get to look forward to that, if so be it. I would give you my opinion on that, but unfortunately we don't have the time. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, and when we come back, I'm going to give you my top 10 Samuel Clemens moments. For those who don't know, Samuel Clemens is the real name of Mark Twain, but we will get to that for my top 10 Samuel Clemens moments. Stay tuned after the break, and we will dive 2 fathoms into Samuel Clemens. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Back. I hope you had a good break. I sure as heck did. We just went over a Russian priest who's trying to create a new Waco, and now we're going to jump into something a little more lighthearted, one of my favorite topics, Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain. You guys are going to love this one. Especially if you love weird news. He is the definition of weird. He is my favorite American writer. And he is often considered one of the first humorists, or modern comedians as you would know them. And he's become quite a controversial figure. We won't get into all the heated debates that most people get into, but I've used a few of his quotes. I even tried to get a few of them into the yearbook that were rejected, and that's where we're going to start off with number 10. Actually, before I jump into this, I kind of want to go over how he's actually a pretty inspirational character. He was one of the first leading people to be anti-imperialist. He spoke strongly in favor of American interests in the Hawaiian Islands, specifically that they should not be ravaged or imperialized. He went on to be an adamant supporter of the abolition of slavery. He went on to pay for several black people to attend Yale Law School, who he thought were, quote, overqualified for the position, but held back due to their race. So I think it's kind of unfair that he's garnered this reputation for being, part of the problem of race relations in 18th century literature. Well, I guess that'd be 19th century literature. So I think it's important that we look more into this and kind of give the man his due. Now, enough with the serious stuff. We're going to go into the weird aspects of Mark Twain. Here we go. Number 10, one of my all-time favorite quotes by Mark Twain. Twain says, quote, "Never argue with stupid people. They will drag you down to their level and then beat you with experience." So this guy's just absolutely savage. He's kind of the original roaster. He really does speak with a comedian's tongue. I actually tried to use this as my senior quote, and my school rejected it. They said it was too inflammatory. But I think it says a lot. I think it's actually true. And I like how he doesn't specify that when you argue with stupid people, it's not that one side of the argument is stupid. It's that there's smart people on both sides of an argument, usually, and it's worth arguing with them and not with the stupid people that you can find on two sides of an argument. I think in 2020, this has become more applicable than ever. It seems that the more stupid somebody is, the louder they are in today's world, so I think this quote should be applied more daily, where we just kind of, ignore the loud idiots and try to stay on a higher level, take the high road, as some people would say, and argue with people who are actually willing to learn and who are open to the idea that maybe they are wrong. But in order to argue with those people, you have to admit that, hey, maybe I'm wrong on this issue. Otherwise, what's the point of talking? Alright, enough of me getting preachy. Let's go on to number 9. So, number 9, in 1864... Mark Twain was a newspaperman, and he challenged one of his rival newspapermen to a duel. And he was kind of known to escalate feuds that he didn't think would go anywhere. But this one did. The man accepted. This is just like a Simpsons cartoon. But Mark Twain said that he's actually a pacifist. So the man said, once you accept the duel, you cannot back out. And so Samuel Clemens ran away. He ran to San Francisco, where he got a job as a reporter and then eventually got fired. They fired Mark Twain. And so while in California, one of Mark Twain's friends from New York asked him to donate a story, any kind of story he could come up with, to a book he was writing. And Mark Twain remembered this story he heard, a true story about a jumping frog competition held in California. And so he didn't expect it to actually get published, so he just kind of wrote up a mock story about frogs jumping. It was called Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. And he sent it to his friend, and his friend thought it was one of the best stories he had ever read, so he sent it into the Saturday Press of New York, which ran it multiple times, and the big story turned out to be a big hit with readers, and was reprinted and retitled The Celebrating Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And that's how Mark Twain, one of the most famous American writers of all time, got his start in the writing business. So if that's not weird, I don't know what is. Alright, number 7. Or no, we're on number 8. Number 8. All right, number 8. Despite being a successful writer, Mark Twain was actually a failed businessman. He became extraordinarily wealthy after writing some of the best-selling books of all time. And so he set aside $200,000 for investment. To give you an idea, the average family in 1890 earned about $1,200 per year. So $200,000 is a lot of money. And Mark Twain went to a convention, and he had a choice. He could invest in a new invention by Alexander Graham Bell called the telephone. But instead of doing that, he invested in an automatic typesetting machine, which is just a fancy typewriter, not a typewriter, a printing press, which instead of having to be manually pressed, would be mechanically pressed, but it had all sorts of problems. So he invested in that rather than the telephone. So, yeah, he wasn't the greatest businessman, and it actually made him go bankrupt. Many people don't know that Mark Twain went bankrupt because of bad business decisions. All right, let's jump into number 7, which is another quote I presented as my senior quote that got rejected. And it is Mark Twain's quote, "Don't put off till tomorrow what you can put off till the day after tomorrow." I presented that to my teacher at school, and she tossed the paper in the trash. I was very upset about it. They had rejected 2 Mark Twain quotes. So for those who think he was a pedantic individual, you should probably take that into consideration. I mean, let's make no bones about it. He was kind of the original class clown. Okay, number 6. This one hits me hard. The Samuel Clemens family had 19 cats at one time. I'm the only cat person on this planet that I know of. And apparently Mark Twain was too. My favorite part is the names he gave some of his cats. The ones that stand out are Bambino, Famine, Pestilence, Satan. He was one of the earliest atheists, so there's that. Satan, Sin, Sour Mash, and Stray Kit. All right, number 5. This is probably the most boring one on the list. I'm not going to lie to you folks. You know I would never do that. But this is a fact you can tell your intelligent friends to sound more intelligent. So I use it a lot, and it's how Mark Twain got the name Mark Twain. As previously mentioned, his original name is Samuel Clemens. But when he created a pseudonym for writing, he came up with the name Mark Twain, which is a phrase used by Mississippi River steamboats when measuring water depth. So they would measure the water, and when it was 2 fathoms deep, they would say Mark Twain, which meant mark the paper as 2 fathoms deep in this position. Or they would shout, 2 fathoms here. Anyway, told you it was boring. But yeah, you can use that to sound intelligent around your intelligent friends, or around your stupid friends. Just make sure you're not arguing with them while you do it. Oh, I think I skipped one. All right, so this is Mark Twain's fact number blah, 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 blah. Mark Twain was one of the earliest proponents of fingerprint scanning. People didn't take a lot of fingerprints for forensics back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, but Mark Twain actually popularized that in his writings. So that's one of the reasons we have fingerprint forensics today. All right, number 4. This one kind of builds on number 6. Although he owned 19 cats, he would rent out cats from the townspeople. So he would walk up to townspeople and say, "Hey, I like your cat. How much for it?" "No, monthly." And so he'd rent cats from his neighbors, which I find hilarious. I think I'm going to try that one day. I'll record it and let you guys know how it goes. All right, number 3. Mark Twain became locally famous in 1907 when he walked down the streets in bathrobe and slippers. He walked down to a public bath wearing those clothes, and these were the days when everybody had to wear suits when they went out. And he had a little nickname for the white suits everybody wore. He thought they were ridiculous. He called them Don't Caradam suits. So yeah, this guy, he's really just your typical insane comedian kind of person. He just didn't have that kind of medium, so he ended up becoming a writer. But yeah, this is the kind of stunt you would see from a modern comedian in order to get small town publicity. All right, number 3. This is a depressing one, so I'm going to do it kind of quickly. This is probably in my top 5 all-time favorite quotes, just because I'm obsessed with the idea of memory. And this is one of his famous quotes. He said, quote, "When I was younger, I could remember anything, whether it happened or not. But my faculties are decaying now, and soon I shall be so that I cannot remember any but the things that have never happened. It is sad to go to pieces like this, but we all have to do it." So, I have a very intimate relationship with memory because my memory is just awful. So I find this quote kind of it kind of gives me peace that he struggles with memory too. So, yeah. My old joke is that I have the memory of an Etch-a-Sketch. If somebody bumps me, I have to start over. So stupid. But, yeah, that's a nice little quote that can keep you going when you feel like you're decaying. All right. So, number 2 is Mark Twain invented the bra strap. This is probably the weirdest one out of the bunch, obviously, and it's kind of funny because everybody knows Mark Twain and everybody knows a bra strap, but nobody knows that the two are so intimately entwined. He patented it in 1871. Goodness gracious. It was originally intended to tighten shirts at the waist and basically replace suspenders, and they didn't really succeed, and then the patent expired, and when it did, somebody picked it up and used it as a bra strap. So, you guys can thank Samuel Clemens for... Okay, we don't have to go into that. Alright, number 1. And we're going to end on a quote, nice, short, and sweet. Number 1. Mark Twain said, quote, "Get your facts first, and then you can distort them as much as you please." Once again, very relevant. Okay. That's it for this week for Weird News. Thank you for staying with us. And thank you for listening to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to our show and write a nice review. It helps us out a lot. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's the easiest way to keep up with the goings-on in the weird news world. Thank you, and have a good night.